Howard Schultz is 7 years old when his father, a truck driver, meets with a terrible accident. The year is 1961. The accident leaves his father out of work for many months. There is no money in the family. The household has been running on borrowed money. They don't even have a proper house. They live in public housing in Brooklyn. Howard's mother is 7 months pregnant, so she cannot go out and look for work. Sometimes Howard's parents would ask the 7-year-old Howard to answer phone calls from people who they had borrowed money from. And Howard would lie to them that his parents aren't home. He never forgot the shame of being poor, the shame of strangers threatening his parents for money, the shame of being refused by a girl because one day the girl's father found out that he came from a very poor family that lived in public housing in Brooklyn. So he worked hard, very hard, and became the first person from his family to go to college. From there, he got a job as a salesman at Xerox, and then at the Swedish multinational company, Hammerblast. There he quickly climbed the ladder to become the director of sales, a salary of $75,000. And this is $75,000 in 1970s, mind you. Howard had made it. He had achieved his American dream. Our story could have ended right here. This is the happily ever after moment. But it's not. Because in 1982, Howard makes a very rash decision. He quits his job at the Swedish multinational to join a small unknown company that no one had heard of, a company that sold coffee beans from 5 tiny stores in Northwest America, a company by the name of Starbucks. His mother was furious. You are quitting a $75,000 job to join a company that no one has heard of? That you yourself had not heard of? Why? Give me one reason why. Because that's what my heart wants, Howard says. Have you forgotten where you've come from? Have you forgotten how hard you had to work? How hard we had to work for you to reach where you are? She's absolutely right. Listening to the heart is not the privilege of people like Howard, who come from nothing. That's common wisdom right here in India too. Dream within your limits. How many times have we heard that growing up? Fortunately, Howard didn't listen to his mother. He listened to his heart, his intuition, his creativity. And this rash decision became the foundation of one of the greatest brands in the history of capitalism. You are listening to All Risk is Creative, and this is Howard Schultz Creates a Culture. Hello and welcome to the second episode of All Risk is Creative, and I'm your host, Palash Kulkarni. Today's story is about Howard Schultz, the man who created Starbucks, or rather the Starbucks that we know of. And not only Starbucks, but the modern day cafe culture itself. This story is also about the simple idea that the act of taking risk is ultimately a leap of faith. That no amount of data or information or rational arguments will ever convince you to take risk. Ultimately, you will have to just listen to your heart. The story begins with a chance encounter between Howard Schultz and the then founders of Starbucks. One day at his job at Hammerblast, Howard Schultz notices that there is this one client in the Seattle area that's buying a very specific kind of a drip coffee machine, in quantities way higher than some of his much larger clients, like Macy's. He decides to give them a visit to find out what's going on. Why are they buying this coffee machine which no one else is buying? The name of the client is Starbucks. Howard Schultz had never heard of them like the rest of America. When he reaches Seattle, he finds out that Starbucks is a coffee store, not a cafe. Meaning, they don't sell coffee and coffee beverages. They sell coffee beans and coffee equipment. They are retailers. That's why they are buying coffee machines from Hammerblast. Schultz meets the founders of Starbucks and asks them about their business. And the founders tell him about their mission, which is to introduce Americans to real high quality coffee. And they go on and on about how they source the best coffee from all around the world, from places like Ethiopia, Guatemala, Sumatra, and how they roast the beans precisely and how they brew using the right methods to make a beautiful, flavorful cup of coffee. Schultz is intrigued. He can see the passion in the eyes of the founders. He had only had instant coffee all his life, so when he's offered a cup of coffee there, he tentatively takes a sip. And before he finishes his cup, he is already in love. It was like he had discovered a whole new continent, he would later say. He felt like finally he'd found his life's passion. That's pretty strong language to describe something as simple as having a cup of coffee. But that's the kind of guy Howard Schultz is. In fact, he is so deeply in love with Starbucks that on his flight back, he decides that he's going to quit his job and join Starbucks. And of course, as we saw before, everyone around him advises him not to because it's just a crazy decision. The founders themselves advise him against it for a very long time. But Schultz is adamant. He's made up his mind. So strong and unshakable is his belief in his own gut instinct that he keeps pestering them for one full year. And finally, in 1982, a full year later, the founders relent and Schultz finally joins Starbucks. Now, Starbucks had 5 stores when Schultz joins the company, all in Northwest America. It was founded 11 years back in 1971 by 3 founders, Jerry Baldwin, Gordon Bowker, and Zev Siegel. Now, these founders weren't businessmen, so to speak. They were artists and designers and history teachers. And they had a deep passion for good, high-quality coffee. And they wanted to spread their passion to the rest of America. That's the sole reason they start Starbucks, as a passion project, not because they have this burning desire to start a business that will change the world. Now, mind you, Starbucks was still a coffee store, not a cafe. All that the founders wanted to do was to sell high-quality coffee beans. In fact, the founders were so into the whole high-quality coffee thing that from time to time they would give these talks and lectures in their stores on what high-quality coffee really is. That was an actual part of the business. I mean, it's great, but how is that good business? How do you scale these lectures? But that's okay because, as I said, the founders were in it for the passion and not for the money. But from Schultz's point of view, now the decision looks even more stupid. Because there he was, suited and booted, earning $75,000 a year in a professionally run multinational, and here he is now, working under these hippie founders who don't even want to run a conventional business. And the amazing part is that Schultz knew what he was signing up for. He knew that the founders come from a very different mindset than his own. And he still joins them. And it is going to become a problem, as we will find out. But first, let's look at Starbucks as a business as it existed in 1982. Now, despite all the flashy and unscalable things that the founders are doing in Starbucks, it isn't really that bad an idea to be selling high-quality coffee in 1982 in America. Because coffee as a product and how it is consumed by Americans is at the cusp of a big transformation. The second wave of coffee has just begun. A good way to understand the history of coffee is to understand it in 3 distinct waves, like the 3 waves of feminism. This framework was proposed by the coffee historian Trish Rothjeb in an article in 2002. She says that the first wave of coffee is the popularization of coffee all over the world, and it's achieved by the invention and commercialization of instant coffee and companies like Nescafe. The second wave of coffee begins in the 1970s with a man named Alfred Peet, a Dutch American who starts his coffee store called Peet's Coffee, Tea and Spices in Berkeley, California. And he starts educating people about what high quality coffee really is. He says that the instant coffee that most Americans drink is trash and the real high quality coffee comes from Arabica beans that are dark roasted. Now, there are 2 types of coffee beans. The Arabica is the original coffee bean. It's called Arabica because, as you know, coffee originates in the Arabian Peninsula. And then there is the Robusta bean, which is discovered much later. And the discovery of Robusta is important because Robusta takes a shorter time to grow than Arabica. It is more resistant to diseases and it doesn't require high altitudes. And so it's way cheaper compared to Arabica. And therefore, it's preferred by companies like Nescafe to make instant coffee. So if you turn to the back of your instant coffee packet, most likely you will find that it contains Robusta beans. But Alfred Pete says that Robusta may be low cost, it's definitely not high quality. The real flavorful high quality coffee is the Arabica bean, especially if you roast the bean dark. Why is that? Because when coffee beans are plucked out of plantations, they are roasted to develop their flavor. And the longer you roast the coffee bean, which is to say, the darker you roast it because the color of the coffee bean turns darker, the more its flavors develop. But because a large part of the coffee bean vaporizes, it adds to the cost but also adds to the flavor. So there's a trade-off between cost and flavor. So Alfred Pete starts championing the idea of roasting the Arabica bean dark, and that's how the second wave of coffee begins. The third wave of coffee is about single origin plantations, meaning coffee is all about the specific plantation and altitude that it is sourced from, but that's not important to our story. Anyway, the point of telling you all this is that the founders of Starbucks, who Howard Schultz has just joined, are actually disciples of Alfred Pete, the man with whom the second wave of coffee begins, and sort of consider him to be their spiritual master in all things related to coffee. And they make his vision their vision, that they will educate Americans about good, high quality coffee. The right bean, the right roasting, the right method of making a cup of coffee, all that. Coffee is their passion and Starbucks is their vehicle. Now, to really understand the psychology of these founders, and it's important to do that because the differing psychologies of Howard Schultz and the original founders is going to become a point of contention. So, to understand the founders, think of that friend of yours who has some really niche esoteric interest and has made that her entire personality, like playing long, complicated board games. And specialty coffee was just that in 1970s and 80s. It was a niche esoteric interest. Today, of course, everyone and their grandmother is a coffee connoisseur, but back in the day, coffee was not cool. It wasn't even on the map. Now imagine you decide to start a business with your board game geek friend. And you tell her that, hey, I have a business idea. I have noticed how much people enjoy playing these board games and how it makes them feel connected to each other. So let's sell them board game sessions. We provide the board games, we give them the space, they just turn up with their friends and have a jolly good time. And you tell your friend that for the business to scale, we can't have these complicated 6-hour long board games, We need to have simpler games. Because what matters is not the board game itself, but the fun and the joy that friends have while playing it. That's what we are selling. Not the board games, but what board games can do. But your friend doesn't care about all that. All she cares about are the long, complicated board games that she wants people to play. And she says, no, I don't want to sell any experience. I want people to play my 6-hour board games. That's all I care about. And that's exactly what happens with the Starbucks founders and Howard Schultz. After spending some time at Starbucks, Schultz sure likes the idea of high quality coffee and roasting it dark and making it well and all that, but he has a better idea in his mind. After joining Starbucks, Schultz visits Italy in 1983 and he falls in love with the espresso cafes there. The romance of walking into a cafe, interacting with strangers, or just sitting by himself and just being alone with his thoughts, and the aroma of coffee in the air and the light music playing in the background, and the high, the caffeine high just pushing him into a very creative space. He loves it so much that he wants to bring that experience back to America. And what better company to do it than his own company, Starbucks? In other words, sure, coffee is good and all, but in Schultz's mind, what was more important is what coffee can enable. What can the experience of going to a cafe ordering a cup of coffee, taking a break from the mundanity of life, experiencing that caffeine high with other people around. What does that do to a person? Coffee is just a single element around which the whole thing is constructed. The offering is not the coffee, but creative renewal. So he takes this idea to the founders that they should be in the cafe business and not only in the coffee business. But the founders of Starbucks, like your imaginary board game geek friend, don't like the idea one bit. They refuse Schultz's suggestion. And the kind of instinctive person that Schultz is, he is left with no choice but to quit Starbucks and start his own chain of cafes. What else did you expect? This guy, after being poor all his life, finally got a well-paying job but quit that job because he had a great cup of coffee and a passionate discussion with the founders. And now his instinct has evolved and matured, and he believes that it's not about the coffee itself but about cafes. He's going to go all in again. Schultz is a textbook romantic. For him, his heart, his intuition, his creativity is more important than data and information. His memoir, which is called Pour Your Heart Into It, almost reads like a manifesto about following your heart, your intuition, your creative instincts. In the book, he quotes from the French novel The Little Prince. He says, "It is only with the heart that one can see clearly. What is essential is invisible to the eye." So he quits his job at Starbucks and starts his own company called Il Giornale, which is Italian for the newspaper or the journal. This second risk is much bigger than the first because he's all alone now. And it's not like he's rich, he doesn't have any wealth of his own. All he has is an idea that he deeply believes in, which is that people in America would also want to go out to a cafe to have a cup of coffee, to socialize or just be by themselves or get lost in their thoughts and have a sort of a creative renewal by giving themselves a break from their mundane lives. Now let's digress here for a brief moment and go to a completely different story that's playing out, not very far from where Schultz is. And don't worry, we will return to Schultz in just a moment. But for now, let's go to Florida, to one Ray Oldenburg, an American sociologist who specializes in urban planning. And he is obsessed with one question, one issue. The issue is that he believes that the American cities of the 70s and 80s are missing the existence of what he calls the third place. The third place is a public place where the citizens of a city go to socialize, to break the patterns of the first and the second places of their lives. The first place is the home, the second place is the workplace, but these two places are not enough if a population or a culture has to lead a creatively fulfilling life. You need the third place, and the America of the 70s and 80s, Oldenburg believes, does not really have a third place. He also goes deep in history to give examples of successful cultures that benefited from the existence of the third place. The tea houses in China during the Jin dynasty, the Roman bathhouses where people didn't only come to take a bath but also interact with the wider community, or the beer gardens of Germany, the cafes in modern France or Italy, and so on and so forth. So he writes a book in the year 1989 called The Great Good Place. And in this book, he introduces the central thesis, the idea of the importance of the third place. You see where I'm going with this? Howard Schultz is not an academic like Ray Oldenburg. He is not an anthropologist. He is not even highly educated. But betting on his own experience and his own instinct, he has identified the same exact problem, that human beings need a place for creative renewal. They need a place to break the mundanity of their lives. He doesn't have the articulation in 1985 when he starts his own company. Oldenburg's book comes out in 1989. Howard Schultz reads it, and he knows that he's on to something. He knows that America needs the third place. Martin Scorsese famously said that the most personal is the most creative. I think it's a very powerful idea, and also something that's not always easy to believe in. Because when we have a personal instinct, a subjective experience that's deeply felt, We think it's only us. It's only our mind and body that's responding to it positively. Doesn't mean everyone else will. But that's not true. As per Martin Scorsese and Howard Schultz and Steve Jobs and many, many people that we will cover on this podcast, they think that if an idea is deeply felt by you, it is likely that it will be deeply felt by others as well. We are all humans after all. We are just lucky that we felt it first. Now it is up to us whether we act upon it, whether we risk our time, money, and effort to build something out of it. That is the essence of risk and creativity. The personal experience that Schultz had sitting in that cafe in Italy, and his instinct that, hey, this should exist all over the world. His personal instinct proved to be a larger truth about the world. Now, long story short, in 1987, the founders of Starbucks, as you may have expected, decide to sell the company. And Schultz decides to buy it. He thinks that Starbucks as a brand name has a much better recall than his little Italian name. And so in 1987, Howard Schultz becomes the CEO and the largest individual shareholder of Starbucks, 16 years after Starbucks was founded. Howard Schultz is not the founder of Starbucks, but in a sense, he is the founder of Starbucks, the Starbucks that you and I know of. And now he has a clear mission to become the world's third place. This is the beginning of the cafe culture of the world. The fact that there's a cafe down your street or thousands of cafes serving espresso drinks in your city, this culture, this phenomena begins here with Howard Schultz buying Starbucks. Before that, it was only limited to a few countries in Europe. Now it's everywhere. Friends, the TV show, comes out in September of 1994, where, if you remember, all the friends hang out in a cafe, in a coffee shop. And that really was the first pop culture representation of cafe culture in America. By then, Starbucks was already a public company with over 400 stores all over America. So the cafe culture had already permeated enough in the real lives of Americans for it to be a narrative trope in a popular sitcom. By the end of 1995, Starbucks market capitalization crosses $1 billion and it is already starting to become a household name, at least within the big cities in North America. Now, I don't want to tell you the entire corporate history of Starbucks. The point of telling you this story was a simple idea that our personal creative instincts aren't special to us alone. They can reveal a deeper truth about the world. But if you do want to read through the entire history of Starbucks, there are plenty of resources online. The Acquired podcast on Starbucks is really good. I highly recommend it. If you want to read books about Starbucks, you can read Schultz's memoir, as I mentioned previously, called Pour Your Heart Into It, and another book called The Starbucks Story by John Simmons. Both these books and the Acquired episode, which also has an interview of Schultz, by the way, are really insightful and give a detailed history of Starbucks. And there are some really juicy stories in there. For example, when Schultz decides to buy Starbucks, he obviously doesn't have the funding. He doesn't have any money of his own. So he's trying to raise funding. And he's almost about to lose the deal when just at the last moment, as the Good Samaritan, appears one William Henry Gates II, who is none other than Bill Gates' father. He comes in, salvages the deal, and the deal goes through. There's also some really heart-touching incidents that Schultz narrates, like when he was starting the cafe business and he was struggling in the initial years. Schultz tells the story of how his father-in-law once visited him and took him on a long walk and told him point blank that, you need to stop doing this. This is not a real business. Find a real job. I'm worried for my daughter. That's very heart-wrenching to hear from your father-in-law. Anyway, I do want to talk about another story in which Howard Schultz, yet again, bets on his instinct, on his creativity instead of data and logic. And this is a very pivotal moment in Starbucks' history. In fact, you can make the case that if Starbucks and Howard Schultz had gotten this particular moment wrong, Starbucks perhaps would not have become the global brand that it is today, and definitely would not have become the world's third place. The year is 1996. Starbucks is already a public company. It has over 1,000 stores across US and Canada. So you can imagine how fast Starbucks grew under Schultz. Starbucks had only 18 stores from 71 to 87 when it was under the original founders, in less than 10 years under Schultz, it expands to over 1,000 stores across North America. But now it's time to expand globally. And the folks over at Starbucks decide to begin with Japan. And Starbucks hires a consulting firm to give them recommendations about how they can enter the Japanese market. The consultant tells them, don't go into Japan. It's a terrible idea. And they give 3 very strong reasons backing their recommendation. The first is that the cost of real estate in Japanese cities is very high. And Starbucks' whole idea was to create these huge cafes because the point wasn't just to sell coffee, but to give this holistic third place experience. But in Japan, with the sky-high real estate prices, it may not make financial sense. The second reason was that even if, let's assume Starbucks somehow decides to enter Japan and create these huge cafes. But the problem is that Japan doesn't really have a cafe culture because the cities in Japan like Tokyo and Osaka and Nagoya are very fast moving. And people like taking out their coffee and drinking it on the subway or while they are walking and so on and so forth. And so if you want to create a third place, the Japanese people are not going to be very excited about this whole idea because it's not really their thing. So your high investment in real estate is actually very, very risky. The third reason, a soft cultural point but important nonetheless, was that the Japanese at the time liked smoking inside restaurants. And if you allow people to smoke inside cafes, it will compromise the quality of the coffee beans as the coffee beans absorb all the smoke and lose their flavor. So you will have to go against the Japanese culture of the time and restrict people from smoking inside cafes. But that will further reduce the addressable market. Pretty solid points, I'd say. I have been a management consultant myself, and I can tell you that these are pretty solid, rounded recommendations compared to the quality of the work that most consultants do. Now, anyone in the position of Howard Schultz would have said, we thought we could pull this off. Looks like we can't. Too bad, let's move on. But not Schultz. On one hand, he has all these logical, rational reasons given by highly paid MBAs. And on the other hand, he has his own instinct, which says that if the idea of the third place is so fundamental to human beings, if it goes to the very heart of what a human being wants in a modern life, and not only modern life, but it has existed in history throughout successful cultures, why should it not work in modern Japan? Japan is also a capitalist society like the US. They also have the 9-to-5 workday that America has. If it's working in America, why would it not work in Japan? In fact, it should work even more in Japan because if life is so fast moving and hectic, they'd be attracted to Starbucks even more. And that will justify the sky-high real estate prices. So against all professional advice, Howard Schultz decides to take Starbucks to Japan as their first step in international expansion, again betting on his instinct. And what happens? Starbucks completely obliterates the market. The response is mind-blowing. People line up outside Starbucks to get in and get their coffee. Today, Japan is the third largest market for Starbucks in number of stores after North America and China. And I've spent quite a lot of time in these Japanese cities, and I can tell you that you are never more than a few blocks away from a Starbucks. And the rest is history. After Japan comes the rest of the world. And Schultz now knows that the experience he had in that small cafe in Italy, the romance of coffee, the romance of the third place, it's not only him, it's not only America, it's not only Japan, it's all of us. Because the idea of the third place goes to the very heart of a modern day consumerist problem. We all crave creative renewal. We all crave community interaction. We all crave that feeling of belonging to something larger than ourselves. Starbucks today is valued at over $100 billion, and Howard Schultz is obviously a multi-billionaire. He is no longer a part of the company, but his vision, his ethos, the storytelling and the brand that he created is still the company's guiding light. In fact, recently, if you've been following the news, Starbucks is going through a bit of a crisis, so to speak. Its same-store sales have declined globally. The stock has only returned some 50% over the last 5 years. That's almost half of what S&P 500 has returned overall. And there are many reasons, increased competition being one of them. Starbucks founded the cafe culture as we know today, but since then, thousands of cafes have come up all over the world that basically replicate the same model. One of the other reasons why Starbucks is struggling, and Schultz believes in this wholeheartedly, is that Starbucks has become overly reliant on the online experience, the Starbucks app, which on one hand is actually very beneficial to Starbucks because people load money in their app, which they don't use for a very long time, so it gives Starbucks some upfront cash, some float to work with. But that's not why Starbucks was founded, right? Schultz recently wrote an open letter to the board of Starbucks saying that you guys need to go back to the original ethos, the original soul of Starbucks, which is that it's not about the coffee, it's about what coffee can enable. The online experience just reduces Starbucks to a place where you can buy coffee very efficiently and very quickly. But Starbucks is not about efficiency. It's about romance, it's about creative renewal. You cannot buy creative renewal, you have to experience it. And from its recent earnings calls, it seems that Starbucks is finally leaning into its original ethos. That can only be good for Starbucks because serving good coffee is easy. Anyone can source the best coffee in the world, buy the best espresso machines, and beyond the point, once the coffee is bare minimum good, most people don't really care about the coffee. But serving a great experience is a creative act. That's not easy. That's not replicable and scalable, unless it is in the very DNA of your company. And that was the genesis of Starbucks. That's why Starbucks is what it is. Not because of the coffee, but because of the experience. All right, let's end this. I was thinking about why was it important to do this episode? Why are cafes important? You can extend that argument to say, why are restaurants important? Why are theaters important? Why is going out important? Or why is culture important? And the conclusion that I came to was that without culture, if we strip down our lives to its bare minimum, our lives are like Sisyphus, the myth of Sisyphus. Our lives are indeed like pushing a heavy rock up the hill before it rolls down and then pushing it up again. But as Albert Camus said, we must imagine Sisyphus to be happy. And that's what culture does to us. It makes the act of pushing the heavy rock up and down a little more bearable. So we can imagine our lives to be happy. That's what culture is. That's what going out is. That's what a cafe is. And we must be thankful to Howard Schultz for creating the modern cafe. And in my opinion, he is less an entrepreneur, less a businessman, and more an artist. He definitely thinks like an artist. He always listens to his heart and less to his mind, almost to a fault. He sees the cafe as a work of art, as a place you go to feel whole, to feel affirmed. So you can go back to your lives with renewed energy and a little more courage to keep living your lives. And I think that's beautiful. That's it for this episode of All Risk is Creative. In the next episode, we will talk about Lee Kuan Yew and how he created a blueprint for building a successful society. Thank you for listening to All Risk is Creative. This podcast is owned and produced by Cosm Entertainment Private Limited. Original music composed by Mehul Fadnavis, sound mixing and mastering by Ankit Thakur. And I'm your host, Palash Kulkarni. You can find me on X at @BiggerSplash. That's ABIGGERSPALASH. If you have any feedback on the podcast, you can DM me on X or write to me at palash@cosm.in. That's COZM.in.